Okay, good evening. So we are, as was mentioned, we are approaching Purim rapidly. It's almost upon us. We have this Wednesday night, we have next Wednesday night, and then the following Wednesday night, 2 weeks from now, will be Purim night. And by then we'll be hearing the Megillah instead of just learning about it. So we'll try to get ourselves as prepared for that exciting time as possible. And so we'll pick up the story of Megillas Esther tonight from chapter 7. And just to remind ourselves where we left off, so Esther had invited Haman and Achashverosh to a feast. And then when Achashverosh asked her, what is it that she's looking for? She said, I want you to come back for another feast. She wasn't ready to tell him yet. Meanwhile, the entire episode involving Mordechai, Achashverosh realizing Mordechai saved his life, he had to reward him. Haman comes to try to get Mordechai hung, get permission to hang Mordechai. In the end, Haman is riding Mordechai around on the horse. He goes home, he's all upset, and his family warns him, and they say, you have to realize who you're messing with. If Mordechai is one of the Yehudim, if he's a Jew, if he's from the Jewish nation, then you should think twice. Obviously, his God is on his side. Look how things are going already. And although it's not explicit in the verses, but seemingly Haman was arguing back. And then we left off the last verse. While they were still talking, the guards come to bring Haman to the second feast. And that's where chapter 7 picks up. And it says, if you're following on the source sheet, it's we're in chapter 7, verse 1. And let me, before we go any further, just deposit the source sheet into the chat in case anyone doesn't have it. Okay, so verse 1 picks up and it says, so the king and Haman came to drink with Queen Esther. So here it says that they actually came to drink with Queen Esther. We mentioned that the first feast, Esther was still fasting. This is now at the end of her 3 days of fasting, and she's able to drink along with the king and with Haman. And that was important because in order to get the king in the right mood, he had to, it couldn't be a one-sided drinking fest. It had to be that Esther was accepting drinks from the king as well. And that is why, according to the Yosef Lekach, part of why she delayed in asking Achashverosh for anything last time, it wasn't an even playing field because she wasn't fully able to participate in the feast. She was still fasting, and now they're coming to drink with her. She has agreed the next day, she's going to be drinking with them. She's going to be part of it. And this time will be the ideal time, hopefully, to ask the king. Now the king comes. How does he feel about Haman at this point? He's coming with Haman, it says. So it kind of depends how you understand the previous episodes. According to the Malbim, the king had discovered that Haman had tricked him with regards to saving the king's life. The way the Malbim had explained was that Haman had taken credit for saving the king from Bigsan and Seresh. And now the king on that night, when they're reading from the Chronicles, he realizes it was Mordechai, it wasn't Haman. So the king is quite angry already with Haman. When Haman shows up in his palace that night, he sends Haman off to guide Mordechai around town. And he's already angry with him because he realizes that Haman tricked him. So that's one perspective. Alternatively, if you don't understand that way, and then there's nothing specifically wrong between Achashverosh and Haman. Achashverosh is okay with Haman. If anything, Achashverosh had suspected Haman and Esther of plotting something. That's why they invited him to this feast, that they must have been in cahoots together. But now he's reassured because he realizes that Esther actually he's reminded Esther was involved in saving his life. Esther was the one who told the king about how his life was in danger earlier on. So now he's actually more comfortable with Esther. He doesn't think she has anything against him. And if she doesn't have anything against him, she must not be plotting with Haman. And so they come together the king and Haman come together, and there's nothing between them at this point. Everything is fine as they walk into the feast. Verse 2, and the king said to Esther also on the second day during the wine feast, what is your petition, Queen Esther, and it shall be given to you? And what is your request, even up to half the kingdom, and it shall be granted? So once again, the king, I think for the third time now, asks Esther, what is it that you request? What is it that you want? Now, in this verse, actually, there's one very subtle change. There's a couple, but one that we'll focus on is when he asks her, what is your petition? He says her name here. The previous times he didn't say, what is your petition, Queen Esther? He just said, what is your petition? And it shall be given to you. What is your request? Why does he add in Queen Esther? So one idea is that he's naming her Queen Esther, meaning the last party, he was a little suspicious of what was going on with her. He didn't speak to her in a respectful way necessarily. He wanted to know. He was very curious. What is it that you want? But he wasn't as respectful because he actually was a little suspicious of why she's inviting Haman and what's going on. So he didn't say Queen Esther last time around. But now he's reminded she saved his life. She has nothing against him. And she says, he says Queen Esther. But furthermore, the Yosef Lekach suggests that he was also withdrawing a little bit in his offer. Originally, he was thinking, what could she possibly ask for? She'll ask for something for herself. Well, anything I give her, she's my wife. So what's hers is mine, and we're a couple. And what could she possibly ask for? She'll ask for something for someone else. She doesn't have anyone else. She doesn't even know who her parents are. So he wasn't afraid that she might ask for something too big because she didn't have anyone else to ask for. She didn't know who her nation was. She didn't know who her parents were. That's what she had told him. And for herself, anything he gives her, he's just giving back to himself, basically. But in the meantime, he realized actually that she does have someone else in her life, and that's Mordechai. Mordechai, who raised her. Originally, I hadn't thought about that. Then he realized, and that's partially why he gave Mordechai such a reward, was he wanted to have paid back Esther. Whatever he thought Esther might ask about Mordechai. Well, I already rewarded Mordechai. You can't ask about that. But now he's still a little nervous. She might ask about Mordechai. So he's telling her now, what do you want, Esther? What do you want for you? Don't ask me for other people. Just ask me for you. That's what I'm willing to grant at this point. So that's why he says her name over here. And now we'll see how Esther responds, because now is the key moment in the Megillah where she's going to reveal that Haman is trying to kill her, etc. But when we approach this, we really have to go back a little bit to when Haman first launched his plans to annihilate the Jewish people, when he met with Achashverosh, actually just a few days ago in the chronology here, just a couple days ago, 3 days ago, 4 days ago maybe, and he shared his plot with Achashverosh, and then they had the letter signed and sent out. So we discussed at the time quite in depth, did Achashverosh know exactly what was going on from the beginning? Was Haman fully open with him about what nation he was trying to destroy, and that he was fully trying to annihilate them, or was Haman tricking Achashverosh? Because depending on which of those understandings we have, the next verses will have to read slightly differently. So one approach we said was from really based on the Talmud and the Midrash, and that's the approach that the Manos Halevi, Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, takes, and that is that Achashverosh was totally in on this. He hated the Jews as much as Haman, if not more. He was very happy for, he had a pile of dirt he needed to get rid of, the Jews, and Haman had a pit that he needed to fill, and they were equally happy to annihilate the Jews. And Haman didn't trick Achashverosh. Achashverosh knew exactly what was going on. That is the way that the Manos Halevi says it, based on the Talmud and the Midrash. The other approach was maybe a little bit more of what we call pshat, like a simple reading of the text, which was that Haman didn't even say which nation he was talking about. There is a certain nation. You don't even need to know who it is. They're so insignificant. You don't even know who they are. And they're terrible to have in the kingdom. They don't follow the laws. And he said all of this, lashon hara, all this slander about the Jewish people. And he said, let me write le'abedam, to cause them to be lost. Meaning, in Achashverosh's mind, that they should become assimilated into people. We'll launch a plan to just totally assimilate them into our nation. They'll abandon all their heritage, all their laws. They'll become just like all the other Persians. That's what Haman had told Achashverosh. But then, when he actually sent out the letters, that's not what they said. When he sent out the letters, they said, we are going to, on the 13th of Adar, we're going to rise up and destroy this nation. We'll come back to the letters a little bit later again, but the letter said, we're going to annihilate them. So he didn't follow exactly what he had told Achashverosh. So these are two approaches. One is Achashverosh knew exactly what was going on. One is that Haman was pulling the wool over his eyes and had told him, didn't even tell him which nation, and told him he's going to assimilate them, and never told him that he was planning to annihilate them. So now let's see, based on those two approaches, what Esther says. So Achashverosh says, Esther, what is it that you desire? And verse 3. And Queen Esther replied and said, if I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, may my life be given me in my petition, and my people in my request. Give me my life, and give me my people. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Now, had we been sold for slaves and bondswomen, I would have kept silent, for the adversary has no consideration for the king's loss. So we'll have to explain those words. So let's break it down slowly and try to understand what is Esther's response here. So, first of all, she says, may my life be given me in my petition and my people in my request. Now, what's the bigger deal? A nation or just her? So she puts herself first. She says, let my life be saved and my people. So what was she saying? What was she telling the king? So it's actually very, very fascinating. The way that a number of commentaries understand, Manas Halevi, is that she was saying, Achashverosh, we've been here before. Remember your previous Queen Vashti. Remember, she did something that you didn't like, and you actually, I mean, she's not necessarily saying all this because she doesn't necessarily know all the details, but somebody recommended that you kill her. Who was that? That was Memuchan. But Memuchan, our sages teach us, was Haman. So that was Haman. Haman has a record already. Haman told you to kill Queen Vashti. Haman wanted you to get rid of your previous queen. Well, guess what? Haman is after me as well. So he drew up this whole plan that he slandered this whole nation to you. It could be you didn't like them anyways, but this is all initiated by Haman. And what does he really want? He wants to get rid of your queen. This is all about me. Just like he wanted to get rid of your last queen, he wants to get rid of this queen. This is all about me. So that's why she puts herself first. She says, again, the king doesn't care for the Jewish people, right? So she says, give me my life, may my life be given to me in my petition and my people, because the people are just a cover up for Haman. Haman's trying to make this about the Jews. Really, it's about me. Really, he just wants to get rid of me because he wants to get rid of your queen again. Why he doesn't ever likes the queen? Maybe he wants his daughter to be the queen. Whatever his motives are, but clearly this guy has a record and he's after me. And this is something that this is something that touches Achashverosh. This is something that really shakes him. And then she says, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain. What does she mean they've been sold? So you remember Haman offered money to Achashverosh to sort of buy the rights to destroy the Jews. Now Achashverosh didn't didn't accept the money, but the commentaries explain that it was as if he accepted it. He kind of gave it back. He sold them and then gave Haman back the money. He said, you keep the money. But he sold the rights to Haman, so to speak, to to annihilate the Jewish people. And so she mentions that here. That's how some understand. Others say she's not crazy, because that implicates the king in this. He was sold. Who sold them? That implicates Achashverosh. That's not what she meant. What she meant by we have been sold was just that we have been sort of given over to this. This is our fate. But she wasn't actually accusing the king of being involved in any way. That wouldn't be very smart at this juncture to try to implicate Achashverosh in this in any way. And she says, if I had been sold for slaves and bondswomen, I'd be silent. That would make sense for you as the king, who, you could always be happy with more slaves. That actually has a benefit to you. But that's not what Haman did. Haman doesn't care about you, Achashverosh. For the adversary, the enemy here, Haman, he has no consideration for the king's loss. He doesn't care about you. If he cared about you, he would, number one, he would have recommended that you keep us as slaves, not that you get rid of us. There go all the tax dollars and you don't even get anything for it. You don't even get slaves. You don't even get workers. He obviously doesn't care about you, Achashverosh. And furthermore, she was saying that, he wants to get rid of your next queen. It wasn't so popular when he got rid of your first queen. You had to make a whole search for another queen. All these girls had to come to the palace. People were not happy with you about that. That did not win the favor of the people of the kingdom. You're going to have to do that. He wants to get rid of your next queen now. And you're going to have to do that again. And you're going to lose even more favor from the people. Again, your enemy has no consideration for the king's loss. Haman has no consideration for the king's loss. Now, I should mention, she hasn't yet mentioned who she's talking about, right? That's going to be the next step. This person that she's talking about has no consideration for the king's loss. And then Achashverosh is going to ask, who is this that you are talking about? And she's going to identify it as Haman. Now, this approach where she makes this all about her, it's all about the queen. He's trying to kill your queen. This helped me understand a very difficult question about the Megillah, which is, so when Esther's first taken to the palace, Mordechai tells her, don't tell who you are. Don't tell your nation. Don't tell your lineage. Don't reveal your identity. Now that we can understand, either it was because, as some commentaries say, if he would find out that she was from royal lineage, he would for sure accept her. She came from King Shaul. She was a descendant of a Jewish king. That would increase her chances of being selected. Mordechai and Esther did not want her to be selected. Don't reveal where you come from. Some commentaries go the opposite. If Esther was taken to the palace, was one of the few people chosen to actually be taken to the palace, approved to be one of the top choices for queen, this is obviously God's hand that this is meant to be, and we shouldn't do anything to spoil her ability to be selected. And therefore, we should not tell them that you're Jewish. That would ruin our chances of you being queen. So they go, it's two opposite approaches, but we understand originally why Mordechai said, don't reveal your identity. But once she settled in, she's been queen for 5 years. Achashverosh did all these things to try to appease her and try to convince her to reveal her identity. Why didn't she reveal her identity? Now, to build the question out even more, wouldn't it have been so much better if Achashverosh knew that she was a Jew from the beginning? If he had known, then maybe none of this would have happened. Haman would have never been able to even, get to where he is now if everybody knew that the queen was Jewish. Why was it to their advantage? Why was it a good thing that she didn't reveal? It sounds like that just messed things up. So I was thinking that, no, I think that we can say that had they known from the start that she was Jewish, that wouldn't have stopped Haman. he would have had to adjust his plans. He would have had to account for that the queen's Jewish. So he would arrange in such a way everybody should be annihilated except for the queen. He would have worked it out. He was a cunning fellow. Let's wipe out all the Jews except the queen. Okay? He could have found a way. But the fact that he didn't know that she was Jewish and that he was including her in his plan was ultimately his undoing. It's only because nobody knew she was Jewish, and therefore he wasn't able to make an exception for her. She was included in his plan of annihilation. Because of that, that's how now she's able to turn it around and say, he's after me, Achashverosh. Achashverosh hates the Jews. She can't just say, please save the Jews. He hates the Jews according to the Monoslave, according to the Talmud. That's not going to help. But if she makes it about her, he's trying to get me, just like he did to your first queen Vashti, then that's able to get Achashverosh's attention. And it's only because of that, it's only because she never revealed her identity that she's able to do that, to say that, to make that claim at this point. So that's why it was so important that she not reveal who she was up until this point. Okay, now that is all assuming that Achashverosh was involved in the plot. He knew exactly what was going on. That's how we would explain the big reveal over here. But according to the Malbim, the other approach was that Haman tricked Achashverosh, and he convinced Achashverosh there's a certain nation, he didn't tell him who, and I'm just gonna assimilate them. He never said that he was going to kill them. And then he actually decided to send letters that said that he was going to kill them. He was tricking Achashverosh. So now it's up to Esther to reveal that to Achashverosh. And that's what she needs to do at this point. So when she says, we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. So number one, she's telling Achashverosh that it's the Jewish nation that he's trying to wipe out, and I am a Jew. I am included in his decree. And not only that, though, but he lied to you. The people were sold to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Not like you thought that it was just to assimilate them. It's much more than that. He tricked you, Achashverosh. This man tricked you, and that's how she's going to get Achashverosh to turn on Haman. And she says again, the last words of the verse, the adversary has no consideration for the king's loss. So the way that the Malbim reads it is, the adversary is not worth anything to the king, meaning there's no reason for you to keep Haman around. That's what she's saying with those words. In the English, it doesn't necessarily, the English translation here doesn't work as well, but in the Hebrew, you can translate it that way. The enemy is not worth anything to the king. The enemy is not worth anything. Get rid of him. He's not working in your interests. He is destroying your kingdom. He's out. Nothing here is in your interest. His whole claim was he was just going to assimilate them for the benefit of the kingdom, but that's not what he's doing. He's trying to annihilate them. So that is how she reveals to Achashverosh that there's, at this point at least, she doesn't say who she's talking about. She says there's someone who's out there to get you. Achashverosh now asks in verse 5, Achashverosh said, and King Achashverosh said, and he said to Queen Esther, there's that double, we'll have to explain that in a moment, who is this and where is he who dared to do this? It's a little bit strange that he doesn't know exactly who she's talking about. This is actually one of the Malbim's proofs that that Haman tricked him, because he didn't know exactly who this was about. There's somebody who's doing all these terrible things. Well, Achashverosh doesn't even know that it's Haman, because that's not what Haman had told him. So this is a bit of a proof for the approach. Again, the simple reading of the verse is that actually Haman was tricking Achashverosh the whole time. In any event, it says, it's a strange verse. And King Achashverosh said, and he said to Queen Esther, what did he say? And then say, So the Malbim explains, others also, it means he first turned to the other people, the chamberlains who I guess were still there. They had brought Haman. We'll see there's Charvona there. There's some chamberlains there. And he said, who's she talking about? And they said, I don't know, right? And then he said to Esther, who is he talking about? And where is he? So she says, and Esther said, an adversary and an enemy, the evil Haman. And Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. So she identifies it's Haman, and he's right here. You know, when Achashverosh said, where is he? Already then, that's a hint that he's going to get, who is this and where is he? I want to punish this person. And Esther says, it's Haman, and he's right over here. And Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. Why is he so terrified? Well, obviously because he's about to, he senses that this may be the end for him. But he's also a little bit stuck. He's a little bit stuck here because, Haman, again, he's very shrewd. He's very cunning, and he could talk his way out of anything. The problem is that it's going to be hard for him to talk his way out of this if Esther and Achashverosh are both present, because he can tell Achashverosh, he can say, everything I said about the Jews is true. I wasn't lying to you. They're terrible. This is to your benefit. He can say that, but then he's just going to anger the queen more, and that won't be too good for him. On the other hand, if he turns to Esther and he starts supplicating her and saying, I didn't know you were Jewish. Had I known you were Jewish, I never would have done this. Well, then the king would say, really? You wouldn't have done this? I thought it was in my interest. I thought this was to my benefit to get rid of them. If she was Jewish, you wouldn't have done it? You made all these claims that this is what was needed for my kingdom. So he's stuck. He can't tell Achashverosh that what he said was true. That would just anger Esther more. He can't tell Esther that had he known that she was Jewish, he wouldn't have done this, because then that will anger Achashverosh and say, oh, you didn't care? I thought you were doing this for me. So he's kind of stuck, and he has nothing to say. But he's smart, he's shrewd, and he waits. And actually, it's to his advantage, and ultimately to his disadvantage, that he waits, because verse 7 says, and the king arose in his fury from the wine feast to the orchard garden. So Achashverosh was so angry, he gets up and he walks out. And now that actually gives Haman the chance, as it says, and Haman stood to beg for his life of Queen Esther, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. So now is his chance. He can actually beg for his life before Esther and say, oh, if I had known you were Jewish, I never would have done this, because now Achashverosh isn't in the room to hear him. But this was all divinely inspired, because it's all part of the plan. Because as the next verse says, verse 8, then the king returned from the orchard garden to the house of the wine feast, and Haman was falling on the couch upon which Esther was. And the king said, will you even, I'll use the word conquer, the queen with me in the house? The word came out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. Okay, a lot to unpack, so we'll have to do it slowly in those verses. But he's supplicating the queen. He's saying, I'm so sorry, please forgive me. And then he actually, this is to his detriment, because he ends up falling over onto the bed. And then Achashverosh sees that, and he thinks, as we'll see, that actually that Haman wants to kill Queen Esther. We'll talk about that in a moment. But ultimately, again, this is part of his downfall. He's very shrewd. He's very smart. I can't say anything if they're both here. But oh, great! Achashverosh got up in his fury. He went out. Now's my chance. Well, actually, that's kind of his undoing again, because he ends up falling over onto the bed, and that looks bad. Again, we'll tell you, it looks like it could be. There's a number of ways to explain what that looks like. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, the king arose in his fury. and he went to the orchard garden. So why did he get up and go to the orchard garden? So simply understood, he needed some fresh air. He's so angry, he went out for some fresh air. The Talmud has a little bit of a backstory here. And the Talmud says, it's on the source sheet. It says, and the king arose from the banquet of wine in his wrath and went into the palace garden. The next verse states, the king returned out of the palace garden. The verses here compare his returning to his arising. Just as his arising was in wrath, so too his returning was in wrath. He didn't get any, he didn't cool down at all when he went out there. Why not? I thought he went out to cool off, to help get over his anger. So why did he come back just as angry? So the Talmud explains, for when he went out, he found ministering angels. He saw that there were angels out there. He didn't know they were angels who appeared to him as people, and they were uprooting trees from the garden. And he said to them, what are you doing? They said to him, Haman commanded us to do this. So the Talmud says that he encountered men. They were really angels, but they were men that were chopping down his orchard, his trees, I think to build gallows on behalf of Haman. And they said that Haman ordered us to do this. The Midrash, the Targum, one of the translations, Midrashic translations, has a slightly differently similar idea that actually Achashverosh went out because he saw them doing this. He looked up, he sees there's people chopping down the trees, and he goes out to yell at them, right? And he comes back, he's very angry. Now, it's a little weird, the whole thing. What's this? What are the sages teaching us with this? What's the message over here? And how is this fair to Haman? Not that we have to be fair to Haman, but that's actually the answer, is that the Manos HaLevi quotes from Rabbi Eliezer from Garmiza, one of the early medieval commentaries, who says that, this it seems almost as if like God is lying to Achashverosh. He's making it seem like Haman is worse than he is. He never ordered them to cut down the orchard, right? So why is he making him look worse? So the answer is, he says, this is what we call measure for measure. This is what Haman did. Haman made the Jewish people look worse than they are. He slandered them in front of Achashverosh. So God is slandering Haman before Achashverosh. It's measure for measure. And in particular, in this type of case, it's, there's a verse in, actually King David says in I believe in the book of Shmuel, I think it's Samuel, that he says that God is crooked with the crooked. We find it by Yaakov, by Yaakov Avinu, Jacob. He's crooked with his uncle Lavan. He kind of tricks him back. He can trick him back. That when you're dealing with a crook, you sometimes have to be crooked back to get to the truth, right? If one person is going like that, so to get to the truth, you also have to be crooked to get it back online. So that's one of the attributes that God uses when dealing with people. And that plays out over here, according to this Midrash and according to this passage in the Talmud. God was tricking Achashverosh to make him even angrier at Haman, but that's measure for what Haman himself did. Now, Achashverosh comes back, and Haman was falling on the couch upon which Esther was. Now, some understand that Achashverosh thought that he was trying to force himself upon Esther. Now, the Manos HaLevi says that doesn't make any sense, because that is the last thing that Haman is going to do at this moment when he's just been accused of trying to annihilate her. And why would Achashverosh think for a second that Haman was trying to force himself on Esther at this party? It just doesn't make any sense, he says. So he rejects that. He brings two other possibilities. One is very interesting to me, that he said one approach based on the Targum, also this translation, is that, remember, just the night before, Haman had showed up in the middle of the night and was waiting in the courtyard of the palace. And Achashverosh said, who's in the courtyard? And they said, oh, it's Haman. Now Haman had come to ask for permission to hang Mordechai. Achashverosh never got a chance to find out why Haman was there. Right? He never got a chance, because he asked him, instead, he asked what should be done for the person the man who the king wishes to honor. Haman gave his answer, and then Achashverosh sent him to go get Mordechai. He never actually found out why Haman was there. So what do you think he thinks Haman was there for? Esther invites Haman and the king to a party. And then Haman shows up at the palace in the middle of the night. It's a little suspicious, right? So Achashverosh thought that Haman was coming for a little rendezvous with Esther. So that's how this verse can be interpreted. He says at this moment, he sees him there. He's pleading with Esther, but he says, you tried to force yourself on my wife, or you tried to be with my wife last night. That's what you were trying to do. That's what he was accusing him. That's why he was extra angry with him at this moment. That's one understanding of this verse. The other is just simply, he thought that Haman was trying to kill her. Either way, he may have been trying to kill her. Whatever he thought that he was there for the night before, now, obviously, things have turned for the worse for Haman. He's like sprawled out in front of her right now. And he says, are you trying to conquer my wife in my house? You're trying to kill my wife now? So Achashverosh is extremely angry now with Haman. His wrath is boiling over. And the word came out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. Why did they cover Haman's face? So the Ibn Ezra, Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra, medieval commentary explains that's what they did in Persia. When the king got very angry with someone, they said the law or the custom was that he didn't have to look at such a person. So they would cover that person's face. But this, explain the commentaries, Reb Chaim Kanievsky, the Yosef Lekach, this was part of the miracle, the fact that they covered his face. This is the shrewd and cunning Haman. If he gets a chance to talk, he can talk his way out of this. He can explain, I was just pleading for my life. I wasn't trying to do anything to her, right? He might be able to weasel his way out of this, but they immediately cover his face. They shut him down, and he has no chance to explain his actions or try to justify what he's been doing. And this leads to the next verse, which says, verse number 9, then said Charvona, one of the chamberlains before the king, also behold the gallows that Haman made for Mordechai, who spoke well for the king, standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on it. So Charvona says, oh, there's a gallows that Haman built for Mordechai, who spoke good of the king. It's 50 cubits high. Let's hang Haman on it. And the king says, hang him on it. And verse 10, and they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordechai, and the king's anger abated. Now this verse, number 9, contains within it many important little miracles that they all come together here. So we have to just keep in mind, this is Haman, the slick-tongued Haman. He knows how to get out of things. It has to be quick. If he has a chance to, he's very powerful. He has lots of people on his side. If his hanging is delayed, then who knows what can happen. But it's not delayed because he built a gallows for him. If you remember from last week, I think we mentioned, the verse says he built the gallows for him. The simple reading was for Mordechai. Really, he built it for himself. And that really plays out in this verse. So first of all, how did Charvona know that this gallows was for Mordechai? Haman had never had a chance to say. That's because, as we mentioned at the end last week, when he showed up to bring Haman to the feast, Haman was arguing with his family about whether he should still try to hang Mordechai or not. And because Charvona overheard that, so he knew that this gallows was meant for Mordechai. And he says, you want to know how bad this guy Haman is? He's trying to hang Mordechai, and Mordechai is the guy that spoke good for the king. I mean, Mordechai is the one who saved the king's life. So it sounds like he wants to hang him because he saved your life. How could this Haman guy? He's terrible. He wants to hang the very person who saved your life. And not only that, it's standing in his courtyard outside his house. It's 50 cubits high. Everybody sees it. It's an embarrassment to you. You were honoring Mordechai, and having him paraded around the city and saying, this is what's done to the man who the king wishes to honor. And at the same time, Haman had a gallows for that same person in his courtyard. How embarrassing is that to you, the king? And not only that, but he said it's 50 cubits high, and here it is. You can see it from the palace. And that's because Haman he built it high enough that he would be able to see when Mordechai was hanging. He knew he was going to the feast. He wanted to be able to see Mordechai hanging. But because they could see it, so seeing is believing, right? So that convinces Achashverosh that it's there, it's meant for Mordechai, and we're going to use it for Haman. And indeed, he says, hang Haman, and then only after that, the king's anger abated. Had it abated before he's hung? Who knows? He might have changed his mind. He's changed his mind before. But only once Haman is hung does the king's anger abate. Now, there's so many things that are just unbelievable about this moment where Haman meets his end. All the things we just mentioned, everything, that the fact that the gallows is already, and you can see it, and they knew about it. But one other very important point we have to come back to, which brings us all the way back to the very first class, which is back to chapter 1. In chapter 1, there was someone else that was sentenced to death, and that was Vashti, right? Here, Haman is sentenced to death. In chapter 1, Vashti was sentenced to death. But their sentences are actually very different if we pay attention. If we go back to chapter 1, and I put it on the source sheet, right there and after verse 10. So it says, and the king said to the wise man who knew the times, for so was the king's word, to present the case before all who knew law and judgment. According to the law, what shall be done to Queen Vashti, inasmuch as she did not comply with the order of the king, brought by the hand of the chamberlains? Achashverosh calls his advisors and he calls in the judges. He says, what is the law? What does the law say should be done? Why doesn't Achashverosh just decide? Because he can't, because he has to follow the law. But then Memuchan declared before the king, and he says, this is so terrible, da, da, da. And then in verse 19 there, Memuchan, who is Haman, says, if it please the king, let a royal edict go forth from before him, and let it be inscribed in the laws of Persia and Media, and let it not be revoked, that Vashti shall not come before King Achashverosh. Now, you may recall when we learned chapter 1, the commentaries say in slightly different ways, but we've mainly focused on the way the Malbim says it. The Malbim understood that that entire party was an attempt by Achashverosh to move from more of like a democratic monarchy to an absolute monarchy, to pull all the power into himself. And part of doing that was making an embarrassment of Vashti, saying my power doesn't come from Vashti, it comes from myself. And that kind of fell flat on its face when Vashti refused to come. However, Memuchan, Haman steps forward and says, you know what, Achashverosh, we could still do this. We are going to give you all the power. And that's that verse. If it please the king, let a royal edict go forth from before him, let it be inscribed in the laws of Persia and Media, and let it not be revoked. That you are now going to be able to put forth laws that are inscribed and not revoked. You will be granted the right to make the laws, to decide the laws. The way the Vilna Gaon learns is that previously Achashverosh didn't have the right to decide in situations that he was directly involved in, that affected him directly, like the queen, or like Haman, his advisor. But now, and his queen, Haman, Esther, he couldn't decide in such cases. However, he was granted some level of absolute power at that moment that he didn't previously have. And that verdict goes out. It's heard throughout the entire kingdom. And then they all agree. Verse 21, miraculously, and the matter pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memuchan. This went forward. From that moment on, the king didn't need permission to act in such a way. He didn't need permission to rule that his prime minister deserves to be hung. Who gave him that power? Memuchan gave him that power. Memuchan had the idea of how to proceed. It was signed by all the officials then. Memuchan hung himself. Haman, Memuchan as Haman, he hung himself. He gave the king the power. Imagine if the king didn't have that power. So Haman is very powerful in the king's court. If this goes to the, before the judges, it's most likely that Haman is not getting hung. If this goes before his buddies on the council, he's going to get out of this. But he gave Achashverosh the power to rule on this case, and Achashverosh rules, and that's it. Hang him, and he's hung, and Achashverosh's anger does not abate until after Haman is hung. Okay. And that concludes chapter 7. So now we can do a little bit of chapter 8. Chapter 8 begins, let me just make sure I didn't miss anything here. Okay. Chapter 8 begins. On that day, King Achashverosh gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the adversary of the Jews, and Mordechai came before the king because Esther had told him what he was to her. Came before the king because Esther had told him what he was to her. And the king took off his ring, which he had removed from Haman, and gave it to Mordechai. And Esther placed Mordechai in charge of the house of Haman. So it's the same day, it says on that day. And King Achashverosh gives Esther the house of Haman. Simply understood, he wants to appease her. He had suspected her of various things. And this is his way of, he thought maybe she was plotting against him. Maybe she was involved with Haman in some way. Now he understands what's going on and he wants to appease her. He gives her the house of Haman. Someone was just sentenced to death. His property becomes the property of the king, and the king grants it to Esther. And Mordechai came before the king because Esther told him what he was to her. Now they know the connection. They knew somewhat of the connection before, but now it's clear they're actually related even. This is they're cousins. And now Mordechai is brought before the king. And not only that, but the king takes off his ring and gives it to Mordechai. So he basically takes the power that had belonged to Haman, and he right now hands it over to Mordechai. And Esther placed Mordechai in charge of the house of Haman. So this is a very important step because Mordechai is being given power. He's being given power that he didn't even ask for. And Esther didn't ask for. They didn't even ask for this. But the tides are turning in their favor. And Hashem, God, is arranging for the future because it's not over yet. So we'll start discussing now, but we'll discuss more in depth in the last class next week. There's still this decree out there. They have to still work on that. It's not over yet. And the power that's being given to Mordechai is going to be very important. Now, the way the Yosef Lekach understands these verses is it's kind of telling us how it played out. See, really, Achashverosh gave Queen Esther the house of Haman. Now, Esther wanted to give it to Mordechai. So in order to give it to Mordechai, she had to explain to Haman the connection, why she's giving it, sorry, not to Haman, to Achashverosh, the connection and why she's giving it to him. So that's why she brings Mordechai before the king. It's really in order to place Mordechai in charge of the house of Haman. And once he was before the king, Achashverosh says, I really like this guy, right? Now, it could be he knew him before. We talked about that earlier, at an earlier point that Esther already advised Achashverosh to take him as an advisor or as a guard or something. But whether he knew him, he didn't know him as well. And now he sees him and he has an open, there's an open position, right? Haman, he just lost his prime minister. And he thinks that Mordechai is a good man for the job. He's in the right place at the right time. And he gives him his ring. And this is going to be very important later for the Jewish people, that Mordechai is in a position of power. And now the verse says in verse 3, we'll read 3 through 6 now. And Esther resumed speaking before the king, and she fell before his feet And she wept and beseeched him to avert the harm of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had plotted against the Jews. Then the king extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose and stood before the king. And she said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter is proper before the king, and I am good in his sight, let it be written to rescind the letters, the device, the plan of Haman, the son of Hamdasa, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I see the evil that will befall my people? And how can I see the destruction of my kindred? When does this happen? Is this the same day? Is this at a later juncture? So it's actually clear from the later verses, pretty clear that this actually happens later. There is a break because the letters that are going to go out, we'll see what they say and what they are, but they go out on the 23rd of Sivan. So this 23rd of Sivan is the 23rd of the third month. We actually had left off on the 16th of the first month of Nisan. So this is about a month, I guess that's more than 2 months later. More than 2 months have passed when this episode now takes place. So let's just keep that in mind. And she continued to speak before him. She now comes back to him. In verse 4 there, it says that he extended the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther arose. Now this is reminiscent of the time where she entered the king's chambers uninvited, at risk of her own life, and he extended the scepter to her, and he said, granted her life. So is that going on here again? That's what it looks like, right? So some commentators understand, indeed, that's what happened here. She was not invited to come again, and she once again risked her life to come back before the king because there was still some unfinished business regarding Haman's plot that had not been dealt with. Others understand that, no, she wouldn't have, that doesn't make sense. She wouldn't have left the palace and then had to come back without getting permission to be able to come back before the king. And when he raises his scepter here, it's just simply, to say, get up, she's fine. She's not risking her life. She's fine. And actually the Manos HaLevi understands that back in verse 1 of this chapter, when it says, and Mordechai came before the king, that actually the whole law about not coming before the king uninvited had been rescinded. And Mordechai came before the king, and now Esther can come before the king freely. I believe some explain actually that whole law was put in place by Haman as a way of keeping people away from the king. Maybe even specifically Esther, because he had his suspicions about Esther, about her connection with Mordechai, whether he knew she was Jewish or not, but he had his suspicions. He wanted to keep her away. That law existed as a result of Haman. Haman's gone, the law goes away. That's how some explain. So she comes before the king, and either way, she's really, weeping, it says in verse 3. She fell before his feet and she wept and beseeched him. And this is the first time that we see such strong language. Why is she all of a sudden so emotional? So this didn't happen the first couple of times when she came before him. Why all of a sudden? So the Yosef Lekach, the Malbim, they explain, time has gone by, as we mentioned, about 2 months. And Esther was hoping that Achashverosh he already saved her life, but she had been hoping that he was going to deal with Haman's plot and get rid of the plot and rescind the letters, etc. But nothing had happened yet. So now she's really nervous. And she's especially nervous because Achashverosh gave her Haman's house. When you ask for something and the person gives you something else, well, there's a message there that says, no, you're not getting that, but you can have a house, right? Have something else, right? So she was actually very, very concerned that Achashverosh had decided that he was not going to rescind the decree of Haman. She'd be safe, but not the people. So that's why she comes in so emotional. She fell before his feet. She wept. She calls on her emotion. She cries. She beseeches him with words. And she goes all in at this point because of that. She thought maybe the king had given up on this, on her people, and was not planning to intervene in any way. And she comes and she basically makes two claims. And what she asks for is, in verse 5, she says, let it be written to rescind the letters. Let it be written to rescind the letters. So we have to really try to remember what these letters were. So the way that we explained it was that there were multiple letters. There was a letter that went out to all the people that said there's a certain nation that we're going to attack on the 13th of Adar. It didn't say who. And so everybody was waiting. In the Hebrew, lios asidim layamazet, to be ready for that day, the verse says. There was another letter that was sent to the governors. Some understand that it was able to be opened by the governor, and it identified who the people were, the Jews, and they were going to tell the people on that day. Some understand that the governors couldn't even open it. That's how the Malim understands. The governors got a letter with the king's seal that said, on the 13th of Adar, you're going to open this letter, and you're going to find out which nation it is that we're going to wipe out. Now, word started to leak out already, and that the Jews found out, and others found out, but that's what it said. So Esther says, you should recall that letter. Call back the letter that identifies the Jews. Call that letter back. Now, even though, as we'll learn, there's a law in Persia that when the king makes a law, it can't be rescinded. And she knew that. And that's going to be how the king responds to her. But she wanted to make two claims. Number one, you didn't even make this law. This came from Haman. So in terms of your own integrity, you should be very comfortable calling it back, because this wasn't from you. This was from Haman, and Haman tricked you. And in terms of the people calling it back, so she said they don't have the law yet. It just says to be ready for that day. They're sealed, so it's not a law yet for them. So she's argued that it should be able to be called back. Now Achashverosh is going to refuse that. We'll have to see eventually how that plays out. But that's her plan, at least. And she makes two claims in verse 6. She says, how can I see the evil that will befall my people? And how can I see the destruction of my kindred? She's talking about two things. And these two things she also refers to in verse 5. She says, the device of Haman, the son of Amdasa. Back in verse 3, beseech him to avert the harm of Haman and his plan against the Jews. So there's the harm, the evil that will befall my people, and then the plan for destruction. What the Malbim explains is that things were already bad. We mentioned this midrash that already in the marketplaces, a Persian would see a Jew and he'd just mug him or beat him up, because why not? You're going to die anyways in a little while. So I'm just going to steal your thing. So there was already a lot of anti-Semitism going on. And so Esther pleads, we need to stop that now. We can't wait till later to stop that, because the Jews are in danger right now. And we certainly have to stop that plot that is planned for the 13th of Adar. So that's what she pleads with the king. And we will wait till next week to find out how the king responds and how everything else will play out, and how we have a Purim holiday to celebrate. All right. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.